You often want to know not just what is actually true, but what is possibly true. Questions about possibility matter both in philosophy and in practical life. In ordinary life, you might want to know whether it is possible to get a certain job, or complete a certain task, or reorder some part of your life in a better way. What you take to be possible will affect what you do next. In philosophy, there are certain questions about possibility that can actually bear directly on the nature of reality. For example, if it is even possible for you to exist with a different body, then it has been argued that you cannot be identical to the body you have now, given the necessity of identity. There are other examples like this, where there's a possibility premise from which you can deduce something actual about the nature of reality. But how do you know what is possible? It is easy to confuse seeing what is possible with merely failing to see what is impossible. How can you tell the difference? One natural idea is that possibility can simply be read off of conceivability. So if you can conceive that something is the case, then perhaps it is possibly the case. And if you can't conceive it, then perhaps it is not possible. And certainly conceivability does have its use. But in many philosophical contexts, the root of conceivability leads rather quickly into dispute. One person says, I could conceive of having a different body, and therefore I possibly could have a different body. And this isn't just an epistemic possibility for all I know. This is a real possibility in the nature of what I am. But then another philosopher says, no, you couldn't possibly have a different body because you are the body that you are. So conceivability leads to this kind of dispute over what's possible. Philosophers have long been interested in how we can settle these disputes and see if we can make progress to know what's actually possible. This video is based on some of my own published work contributing to this inquiry about how we could see what is possible. We can begin from a point that is difficult to deny. The surest way to know that something is possible is to know that it is actual. For example, if there are actual conscious beings, then consciousness is possible. If there are causes, then causation is possible. And if there are trees or stars or thoughts, then trees and stars and thoughts belong at minimum to the range of the possible. Actuality in this sense is the clearest window into the possibility. But actuality also leaves much unseen, for actuality reveals only a portion of what could be. It does not by itself tell us whether reality might have contained more, or less, or otherwise. It does not directly tell us whether some neighboring state of affairs, which was never actualized, nevertheless was open to reality. So the question becomes whether we can move outward from the actual in a principled way. I think we can. Consider an ordinary sort of case. Suppose there could be a vase that is 2 units tall, and that another vase could be 4 units tall. Then it seems that there could also be a vase that is 3 units tall, a height between the 4 and the 2. Why think otherwise? The suggestion that there could be vases of many nearby sizes, but somehow not of that particular size, strikes the mind as odd, even epistemically repugnant. Or consider a thought from Aristotle. He says, if 2 bodies could occupy the same space, if that's even possible, then why couldn't 3 occupy the same space? Why should the difference between 2 and 3 suddenly introduce an impossibility? So you might think it's impossible for 2 bodies to occupy the same space. That might be impossible. But if it were possible, then it seems that this difference in number from 2 to 3 wouldn't be a relevant difference. If a line is to be drawn, where is it to be drawn and why there? In such cases, we find ourselves guided by a kind of continuity. A small difference in degree does not seem, just by itself, to generate a radical difference in what's possible. The core idea is this: if one situation differs from another by a mere quantity, then those 2 situations do not thereby differ with respect to whether they are possible, at least other things being equal. This principle is not meant to be a proof or an unbreakable law. It is meant rather to be a guide, a defeasible guide. It offers some initial reason, not certainty beyond revision. Even so, that is already an epistemic gain, a gain in what we could see or have reason to believe is possible. For suppose one has no independent reason to affirm or deny some possibility claim. Then one notices that the claim differs only by degree from some other claim that is reasonably well supported as possible, such as a vase that's possibly 4 feet high. Maybe you see a 4-foot high vase, and now that gives you some evidence that it would be possible in principle for there to be a vase that's slightly taller or slightly shorter. In that case, one has acquired at least some reason to think that the neighboring claim may also be possible. One has extended one's modal vision. The suggestion here is that reality may contain a kind of modal inertia, or an inertia with respect to what's possible. Once possibility is present at one point in a range, then nearby points may inherit a presumption of possibility unless there is some special reason to think the line is broken. The burden shifts then. Instead of asking, how could that be possible, one sometimes ought to ask, what would make this neighboring case impossible? There are classes that look continuous at a glance, but contain impossibilities for independent reasons. For example, a two-sided polygon is not merely an unfamiliar case of polygonhood, it is impossible, even though a three-sided polygon is possible. Sometimes logic can limit what's possible. In this case, where you can see a limit in what's possible by logic, this is a reason to break the continuity of what's possible. But in the absence of this, it seems that neighboring states that differ merely in quantity are not made impossible just in virtue of that quantitative difference. Now, in my published work, I explore technical modifications to the simple general principle, the general principle that, other things being equal, mere quantitative differences don't make a difference with respect to what is possible. But I want to set aside these more sophisticated technical adaptations because I think the simple general principle is good enough for practical use, both in life and in philosophy. Consider in life. An invention often begins not with seeing the finished thing, but with seeing that one more step is open. A tool can be made a little lighter. A system can be arranged a little better. A phone can be made a little more efficiently, and so on. Very often, what opens a new future is not a direct vision of the whole or of what's possible. Often the deeper question is whether one has learned how to move from the clear case to the neighboring case, whether one can see not by seeing everything at once, but by seeing the neighbors to where one's at. There's a book called The Adjacent Possible. In this book is all about how new technologies emerge by being next to or adjacent to existing technologies. The place to look for advancement is next to what is actual. Moreover, there are philosophical applications that become illuminated by this tool of possibility. Take the question of the foundation of reality. One argument developed from this framework concerns contingent causers. If there can be causes of there being many contingent causers, then continuity reasoning gives us some support for the thought that there can be a cause even of there being very few contingent causers. Indeed, even if there being exactly one contingent causer. Yet no contingent causer could be the cause of there being contingent causers in the relevant foundational sense, because that would involve a kind of circularity. There can't be a contingent causer that causes there to be exactly one contingent causer. From here we can actually arrive at a striking conclusion. There can be a necessary causer. And, under standard modal principles of possibility, we can argue from the possibility of a necessary causer to its actual existence. Here, continuity does not do all of the work, but it plays a role in supporting a key step in this kind of argument from possible causes to a necessary foundation of these causes. Or consider what follows if there is such a necessary causal foundation. How much could it do? What could it cause? It is not easy to see why there should be an upper bound to what it could do. If it could produce 25 turtles, then it seems like it could also produce 26 turtles and 27 turtles and so on. And if no principled reason breaks the continuity here, then we have some reason to think that its power is unbounded and unlimited. Now, this does not settle every theological or metaphysical question that we might ask about fundamental reality, but it does show us how a careful tool of reasoning could give us surprising results in thinking about what's possible. Let us consider one final example in the philosophy of mind. If a conscious being could survive a single tiny exchange in bodily matter, then one could argue by this continuity principle that it would be possible for it to swap bodies or have a different body. This is because tiny changes are possible and they add up to large changes that are possible according to this principle of continuity. Or again, if arrangements of matter differ by degree, then a theorist who says consciousness necessarily emerges at one arrangement, but not at a nearby one, may owe us an account of what explains why consciousness necessarily emerges here rather than there. The point again is not that continuity settles these disputes all by itself. The point is that it changes the shape of the discussion. It affects the dialectic. It teaches us where the pressure lies in our thinking about these topics. All of these examples bring us back to the deeper theme. How do you see what is possible? My thought here is that in at least some cases, seeing what is actually the case and then considering adjacencies to what is actually the case gives you reason to extend your sight of what's possible into these adjacencies. One obstacle here, however, is psychological, not just philosophical. People often assume that if a conclusion is not immediately visible, then it cannot be reasonably approached. But many things become visible only through an ordered movement from what is clearer to what is less clear. This is true in science, it is true in mathematics, it is true in ordinary life. And I think it is true in an important way in this inquiry into what's possible. When you confront a question about what could be true, what could exist, what could change, or what could be built, it helps to resist two opposing temptations. Resist the temptation to collapse possibility into present actuality, as though the real or the actual exhausted the possible. And resist the temptation to untether the possible from reason, as though whatever can be loosely entertained or conceived is thereby a genuine option. Instead, begin with the clearest cases, and what lies nearby will be a guide to extend your sight of what could be, so you can move step by step into greater light. I hope these ideas help you not only to see more about what's possible, but also to see what steps are next in your journey, both towards truth and towards your own personal advancement. Thank you for watching.